Well, quite a weekend this weekend for those of you that are into different wonderful sights as far as the universe is concerned. We had the super moon, right? Did anybody notice that? It was clouded over this morning, so if you saw it yesterday, you got a better look at it. Something like 13% closer than it usually is, so it's brighter. And so we see this thing we take for granted, this universe that's so, the stars and everything that goes with it. And yet this Jesus was there in the beginning, as he says in 1 John, in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. The Word was with God. And so we know that it was a surprise to the Pharisees to hear this gentleman, this man, this person that they knew had been born of Mary and had been raised by Mary and Joseph and had not been, very popular perhaps or even that well known until he began his ministry. And then beginning his ministry came into this world and, as we often have talked about, just turned the world upside down. Turned it upside down. And so we have our world, which we know and which we understand somewhat, and perhaps we're trying to figure out, and we have the different difficulties and the things that are in our world that are perplexing and perhaps challenging, school or joining the National Guard or whatever it might be. And those things can come into our life, and it's like, well, what is this business about a gate? I am a gate. What is this business? And at the same time, at the time that Jesus was here and John was with him, and John was a disciple that not only wrote the book of John, but John was a disciple that had been a disciple of John the Baptist, and seeing John the Baptist, seeing Jesus walking across, had pointed to him and had said, "There goes the Lamb of God. He takes away the sin of the world." And John and Andrew went over to Jesus and followed him. And Jesus turns around and says, "What do you want?" Basically, what do you want? And they didn't quite know perhaps how to say it, but they said, "Where are you staying?" And Jesus said, "Come and see." And so my invitation, by the word that I'm repeating, by the word that we're looking at in John, especially John 10, it says, come and see. See this world which was turned upside down. See this world which, for them, they also had their own problems, their own situations, their own difficulties. They were perhaps as confused, but also maybe as manners so set, and they thought they understood, and yet here this Jesus came in and turned things around. One of the things that he did that we already have referred to is that Jesus said, "I am." And in saying, "I am," the Hebrews knew very well what he meant by that. He was saying, "I am who I am. I am Jehovah." And you just don't say that. You just don't go around saying, "I am God." And yet Jesus did. And Jesus not only just said that, but he had the power, the strength to show and to do that so that they could not ignore it. He had the signs, as John calls them. So he changed water into wine. He takes 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes and feeds 5,000. And then he, as we discussed last Sunday, he said, "I am the light of the world," and not only said it and argued with the individuals that did not want him to be true God, that did not want him to be the light of the world, argued with them, but then when he sees a blind person, and the disciples ask, why is he blind? Is it because of his sins or his parents' sins? He says, neither. It is so that I may show the power of God. And he brings sight and light back to this individual, this blind man. And we go from chapter 9 to chapter 10, and right from this point, he then starts a new metaphor, a new parable, and then adds to, "I am the bread of life, I am true, I am the light of the world." He adds to that and says, "I am the gate." Let's take a look at that. This is our theme verse, John 10, verse 9. And John 10, verse 9, as we read, says, "I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture." They will come in and go out and find pasture. Interesting. they will come in and go out and find pasture. And we're talking now, of course, he's talking in words that can have to be interpreted as the children interpret it. It doesn't mean just going out and finding grass or just going out and finding enough food for us, but it is going out and finding what is needed in life. Now, when we talk about gates, what is a gate for, and what different kinds of gates are there? And we have a bunch. And the one that I'm showing you right now is from Emma, Missouri. And if you haven't heard about Emma, Missouri, then I have to tell you about it, don't I? And that's where I grew up. We had 5 acres. And so it was sort of like living on a farm, but without all the work that farmers had to do. Except we did have cows, and we had chickens, and we had, cattle. And we also had gates. And the gate on the left, if you see it as I'm looking at it, screen left I guess it's called, there's 2 gates that actually come together. And they're old and they're weathered much later than the one on the left. I must have put a few nails into that one when I was a kid, and I just sort of remember that. But I also remember what the purpose of this gate was. Now, we had a double set of gates. If you look back a little bit further by the old shed, and we had, and not at the time that this picture was taken, but when I grew up, there was a great big red barn. But back there by that shed, there is a fence, and so there's another set of gates. And that's where the cattle stayed. But in that space that you can sort of look, and you can see a tree, and you can see the grass, even though it's wintertime. In that space, the chickens had, they could do whatever they wanted to do. They could graze, and they could hide their eggs, but they also had a place in the barn where they were supposed to come and lay their eggs. Now, most of the time, chickens, except for watching carefully where you walk, chickens were not too much of a problem. But every once in a while, we would have a rooster. And a rooster, the one that I remember, a rooster is very defiant. It takes a personal anger against anybody intruding in their territory, and especially when you're about this size and you walk through that gate and you close that gate and a rooster comes after you and it's flapping its wings and it looks about 3 times the size that a rooster really is. I'll tell you what, you ran in a hurry, and I did. So I have a special significance to that gate. So it protects us. It protects us. And so Jesus uses this gate. And also, when we talk about gates, we need to make a quick reference to Jerusalem. It's the city where most of the action and activity happened, especially during that last week, the Holy Week. But in Jerusalem, Jerusalem had a high wall, and it therefore had to have gates. Now, those gates were at one time built by Solomon and perhaps even under King David when he was there. But then they were knocked down. The wall was knocked down. The temple was knocked down. The people were taken into captivity by the Babylonians, and it was their holy city. And now, look, this is a little different than anything that we might comprehend. Their holy city was where their God was at, and their temple was destroyed. And so when there was a new ruler in Persia that allowed them to go back and rebuild the temple, they were so pleased and so happy because they could see that the nation was coming back. They could see that they could worship God. But then Nehemiah, as we read in the book of Nehemiah, accepted or was a friend of his, he calls him a brother by the name of Hananiah, came into his presence. Nehemiah was the second in charge of this country. And so Hananiah comes to him and he says, well, how is it in Jerusalem? And he said, not good. The walls are in ruins and the gates are broken down. The gates are broken down. And in that sense, as they would understand it, that means that anybody could come in and defile their holy city and defile their God. And so Nehemiah turns very carefully, starts praying, and turns to his ruler at that time and asks permission, and then does go back and rebuilds the walls and the gates. Now, interestingly enough, the first gate that is built was rebuilt by the priest, by the Levites, and it was the sheep gate. And the sheep gate is where the sheep would come in, be brought in for the sacrifice for the lambs. Now, the Hebrews, the Jews, understood that the lambs represented the Messiah that was to come. And they understood that as the lambs came in, this was in tribute to the Messiah that would come. In the sheep gate, the sheep gate also was where Jesus walked through on that Friday, in which he was carrying a cross. Maybe at that time he no longer could carry it, but he walked through that gate on the way to Golgotha. Jesus did that. But let's go now about 3 years earlier, or at least prior to this time. Let's take a look at what he was doing here, what Jesus was doing. And I ran across a word, or a statement by John Updike, the author. And John Updike was talking about baseball and talking about one of his champions, who was Ted Williams. And he said, Ted Williams shows the hard blue glow of high purpose. Now, for those of you that are sports buffs, what he was describing was that Ted Williams, you just look at him and you knew that he was special, the hard blue glow of high purpose. Now, my thought, my idea is that Jesus coming into this world walking not only showed the hard blue glow of high purpose, but showed the beautiful, bright light of divine purpose. But it wasn't easy for the people to accept him. It wasn't easy for them to understand him. And so let's then turn to later in John 10, and we take a look at the verses, John 10, 1 to 6. Now, we set this up already. We talked to you that this came right after the blind man had been healed. He no longer was blind. And so then Jesus continues. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. He's talking to people that were very religious. He's talking to people who thought they understand what God's purpose was. He's talking to people that are looking at him and saying, who are you to tell us this? And this is what he says. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Now, according to a gentleman by another author, another Keller, who was a shepherd. The book was written about 30 years ago, and he was a shepherd about 30 years prior to writing the book, before he became a pastor. And he talked about being a shepherd, and he talked about the practices of being a shepherd in this particular part of the country. And he said it was customary for the shepherd to lead, not to drive, but to lead. And the people, the sheep, would know him by his voice. And so this is what Jesus is sharing with the people that had gathered around. But as it says, the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. So he adds to the metaphor. He adds to the metaphor. And he says, he changes it all. He now presents himself as the gate itself. Through you, through Jesus, through me, he is saying, you will be saved. And the verses go like this. Therefore Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out, and they will find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And another translation that says, and have it abundantly. And have it abundantly. So if we know the right gate, and we use the right gate, and we go through this gate, we will have life abundantly. Leading the sheep, the shepherd would lead the sheep out and to the pasture that would be what they needed. Now the shepherd that I'm quoting, the Keller, said that sheep, he said something like, sheep are dumb.